Hello and welcome to the Counterweight podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this podcast, we'll be speaking to Eric Vieth, who is an academic, a trial lawyer, and the host of the Jury Is Out podcast. Today, we will be talking about Brandolini's law, strange bedfellows, listening to people, and crucially, the importance of community. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Mike Burke. This is the Counterweight podcast. I'm here with my co-host Elizabeth Spivak. And Elizabeth's going to give us a quick intro to our guest, Eric. So if you could...
Yes, we are here today with Eric Vieth. He is an award-winning trial attorney in St. Louis, Missouri. He's co-host of the nationally syndicated podcast, The Jury Is Out. He blogs about current events at his site, dangerousintersection.org, and he's also a photographer and digital artist. He is part of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression Legal Network, and he describes himself as an individualist with iconoclast tendencies. I look forward to finding out what he means by that. Eric and Mike and I all met at the Heterodox Academy conference in June, where we saw Eric's talk on Brandolini's law, among other things. And so I'd really like to start with Eric telling us about Brandolini's law.
If I can make one tiny correction at the beginning, I love being part of the FIRE family, but I'm not an employee or agent of FIRE at the organization itself. I'm one of the many attorneys who have come forth to FIRE and offered our services in case they need an attorney to represent somebody in my state of Missouri. But I love to be associated with FIRE. I just thought I might want to make that correction that I don't speak for FIRE.
That is what they called it, was the legal network. So that's why.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
I'm one of the many attorneys who feel passionate about the kinds of cases they handle, First Amendment cases, and we have offered that if they need help, if one of the people that contacts them needs help in Missouri, I would be happy to help them. Brandolini's law is the nickname is the bullshit asymmetry principle. May I say bullshit on this podcast? Is that okay? That's what it is. So what it means is that it's a lot easier to say something that is nonsense, fallacious, or so forth in a conversation than it is to repair that. So if someone came up to you and said the Earth is flat, it's not round, they can say that in 3 seconds? And for you to convince them otherwise might take an hour or more or never. And so what we have in a lot of our conversations these days are a lot of people that have an advantage, a temporal advantage over us, and that they can spew out lots of things that don't make sense, or they're ad hominem attacks, straw man attacks, Chesterton's fence, all kinds of these notorious mechanisms for getting things wrong. And for us to repair the conversation and keep it productive, it takes a lot longer. So for many conversations, it feels like the longer the conversation goes, maybe the farther behind you're falling. And it can be really frustrating for many of us. It happens not only in person, it can especially happen in social media, where you post something that you're thinking is pretty well reasoned, maybe an article about a topic of the day, and then the comments pour in, and it may be all kinds of stuff that you're thinking, do I have the time in my life? We're all born with 1,000 months more or less in our lives. And do I want to spend this valuable time trying to set the record straight in all these ways?
And I was really interested in that in part because I think I told you in psychology we call this the continued influence effect, right? Where information that's learned first tends to be particularly sticky, and it takes and corrections don't sort of stick quite as well. And there's been, some research to trying to figure out what the best kind of corrections might be, whether it's before you see the information, during seeing the information or after. And of course, most of us are stuck with the after anyway. So it'd be nice if we could pre-bunk everything, but we're sort of stuck with the after. I was just really interested in this idea of it taking a magnitude more of correct information, right, in order to attack one small, as you say, something that took only seconds to tweet or to say, and how do we react to that? Mike and I've struggled to, he's doing a better job than I am, but to talk to people that we so strongly disagree with, and how to come together. And so I'm interested in also some of the things that you talked about in your talk about people coming together, people who are really unlikely people to come together and talk.
Yeah, a number of things. Thank you for sending me those articles recently on the stickiness. And I forget what the models were exactly called, but one was the concurrent something model. And that was the idea that it might not be that the new information doesn't get in. It might be that it just gets in and it just doesn't get rid of the old stuff. It doesn't clean out the old stuff. It's, okay, so now you got two versions of a claim just in your head, so you kind of freeze and you don't really have, you don't get a clean thought now, even though you've been corrected. The correction doesn't really take care of the problem. And so, I'm a trial lawyer, and one thing we have in court is we have motions that are called motions in limine. The idea is to not let improper evidence get in the first place. And you ask the judge, I would like to not have A, B, C topics be discussed in front of the jury. We don't want questions asked about it. We don't want argument. We don't want opening statements on these things or voir dire discussions. And if you can keep the jury from ever hearing about it in the first place, it's far better than having something that might be problematic get in, and now you're trying to explain to the jury why that doesn't make sense, and don't think about that because that's not the right thing. And now you got this problem that you're talking about, this stickiness problem. It shows up in other places too, like Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, and he talked about the paradigm shifts. Science doesn't work in a methodical, steady way like you might think. New information comes in. It doesn't work that way. It's just like something's not making sense, and but the establishment and the scientists and the institutions just keep clinging on to the old one until like the dam breaks, and then finally we're into the new paradigm. So it works. The stickiness thing works both for institutions and for individuals.
One of the things that I like to say is to my students is that forgetting is actually the friend of learning, right? That we do have to forget sometimes what we originally learned because there's this new information. We think of forgetting as only being a negative. We talk about forgetting as negative, but it actually it actually helps us to learn new things, and like you said, in a more, less contaminated way. If we can forget the old sometimes.
Thank goodness we can forget. I've done a lot of dumb things in my life, and I like not remembering those things eventually.
I'm not finished doing dumb things in my life, I'm quite sure. With regards to this abstract notion of science, I think this is a really interesting point to kind of labour on, because certainly with critical social justice, we've seen that take over the various scientific institutions and lend itself to arguments that would appear to be, if we were to apply science as an abstract model, bullshit, for lack of a better word. For example, certain protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, were allowed because they were somehow combating some kind of institutional racism, and these, like the CDC and places like that, allowed that to go ahead, even though that kind of behavior, having people, albeit outside in such a close space together, was likely to spread COVID, for example. So in my own kind of academic work, I kind of talk about science as being three things. People think it's one thing, but it's actually three, maybe even more than that. We've got science as a method, we've got science as an institution, And we've got science as a narrative, so the institution being the various universities, laboratories, academic publishing companies, the narrative being the story that's told about science, and the method being the scientific method, how do we falsify things, can actually be quite divorced from both the institution and the narrative that's offered up. So yeah, I mean, like this kind of the fact that at the moment we can find these, in keeping with Brandolini's law, we've got these arguments that are given weight from various scientific institutions. It's very, very, very difficult to push back on that.
Mike, I don't think you were able to attend the talk, but I started off by talking about my profession, the legal profession, and I asked a hypothetical. Does the way that trials are conducted, does that give us any ideas for maybe how we can try to keep things in check and regular on-the-street conversations or conversations at the Thanksgiving table? And I went through the various things that go on in court, and it's not just people talking. It's as Jonathan Rauch would point out, institutions have all kinds of checks and balances. The legal institution has probably more than most, and they're very heavy-handed enforced at times. There would be a judge right there to make rulings on the balls and strikes and say who can say what in front of the jury, what kind of conversation are we going to have. And there's all kinds of rules about, what kinds of questions lawyers can ask, and there's special education that goes into lawyers, and it may go into the fact that lawyers themselves, especially if you're going to be a good trial lawyer, you got to be able to understand the other person's case. You can't just shut down and not listen and pretend no one else is going to say that, because you got an opponent. If you don't want to say it, they're going to say it. They're going to give their viewpoint very well and very hard. So there's an institution that I work in. That's my my profession. That can we export some of that? And my conclusion, unsurprisingly, is no. Unless you're going to bring a judge to sit at the Thanksgiving table, and things like that. But then the next step is, this is an institution that is being buffeted right now by a lot of the issues. For instance, the one that you mentioned, social justice. There's others, but I see it in law schools. I see it, for instance, in that First Amendment supposed lecture that was going to happen at Yale that was shouted down by Yale students. The lecturers had to be escorted out by the police. So there's problems. There's a lot of people condemning the rule of law in one or more many ways. And so the second part of my talk was, how do we protect our institutions? Is there a way to do it? And I'll be really quick here. I thought, can we fortify them with more rules? And I thought, well, the conclusion, no, they got plenty of rules. And rules don't protect institutions. So if you have say you have a guarantee of free speech in North Korea or the Russia constitutions, which you do. Does that mean you have free speech? No, the rules don't give it. You have to have people at bottom enforcing those rules. So Jonathan Rauch in his book, and I pointed out two sections where he's of two minds of this. How do you protect the institutions? Do you work on the people-to-people interactions? The individual, or do you work at the institution level, because it's very powerful, and the institutions form the individuals that work in the institutions, and the individuals form the institution. So it's like a two-way street that's going on. So where do you get to work? And I think at bottom, on an ordinary day-to-day basis, it's going to take courageous conversations. That's what it's going to take. It's going to take all of us being willing to speak up, because that's where the action is in my brain anyway. When I walk into a place, that's me. I can open my mouth and say something or not. So what most of my talk was, and I'm going to pause here because I know you probably have some feedback to this. I offered about, I think, 20 suggestions for things that I think about for trying to keep conversations productive, even when the stakes are high, for instance, or the emotions are high. So these were just things drawn from my own experience and from reading various things, and I offered them, I won't have my funny slides. I tried to have some silly slides to go with it, but you'll just have to imagine those.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much for that. One of the things that the starting off points, and this is one of the jumping off points initially with Heterodox Academy, right from the beginning, is that they were holding up John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And I'm paraphrasing Mill here, but Mill basically says, look, even if you know your own argument, in favor of any given thing, let's say evolution, for example. So you're an evolutionary biologist, you understand evolution really, really well, you can lecture on it, you understand the science intricately. That's not enough. Right, you have to know all of the intelligent design arguments, for example, and those arguments may not be very good, but you need to be able to know the arguments of your opponent in their best possible form.
Right.
And so, for me personally, that's what I've done. I mean, I've gone in. I started off kind of being a bit kind of woke myself. Then I had the woke people go after me, and then my reaction was to be, I'm completely against all of it. It's all bullshit. And then the next stage of my intellectual development was to do the John Stuart Mill thing, was go, okay, let's go back into postmodernism, critical theory, the original critical theory, then go into Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw's early work, and let's do my best not just to isolate the things that I disagree with and explain and use that as ammunition against my opponents, but actually let me try and take these arguments in their strongest form, and then if I can, let me even add to them. Let me kind of take out the weak parts and see if I can make a better version of it myself.
Steel Manning.
Because only at that point, yeah, exactly, Steel Manning. So only at that point am I really qualified to really pass judgment upon these ideas. And so I've done that. I mean, I've, in my time as an academic, I've gone out of my way to do that. But what I found has been really disappointing because, John Stuart Mill's predictions, and that was picked up by Heterodox Academy, would be, okay, we've now got somebody who really appreciates critical social justice and is able to point out ideas from critical social justice and say, look, this is actually good, this is actually useful. But what I found has been so disappointing. What I found is that the people who I then try to engage on the level of, okay, let's not talk about what I disagree with you on, let's talk about the various good points. They can't engage on that level because they don't seem to have engaged with the literature intellectually. There are one or two that have, and by the way, I'm not talking about people on the street, I'm talking about actual academics, right? Actual academics who claim to have their careers invested in this stuff. And the majority of them are almost like what I would imagine to be a right-wing straw man of their own argument, right? They don't seem to know their own literature in any depth. And so when I try and engage with them, I don't get anywhere.
Does that tell you?
They're kind of they say they're exhausted or exasperated, and it's like, no, I'm not even challenging you. It's very, very strange experience.
I suspect I hear some reverse engineering where someone takes a position and is justifying it rather than doing what you're suggesting, what you were thinking that was going on, which is they were reading the basic literature from the 60s and then elaborating on it and building upon it. But I think there's a lot of people that don't. That's not where they're getting their idea, maybe, and so that's not a good interaction point. I think it reminds me of, a lot of in counseling. One of the best techniques is to, restate what the other person is saying, and that's what you were attempting to do. You were attempting to go back to Crenshaw and the original writers and say, I'm going to restate it better than you can. Well, maybe that's not where they're coming from. Maybe that's not really their foundation. Their foundation might be just today, something they've heard on the street or a slogan or.
Right.
And so it seems best to me as a starting point to listen. I like to use listening as a weapon. In other words, just tell them, hey, tell me what you're thinking and why. Really, I'll sit here for 10 minutes. You just tell me. And it's interesting. A lot of people think they know a lot more than they know. And when you put them on a spot by saying, okay, just tell me everything you're believing and why, and I would love to hear you. And actually Daniel Kahneman has there's a name for this, where you let them, they say, hey, I know 10 reasons, I know 20 reasons for this. And you say, okay, tell me them. And after about 3 or 4, I think it's the unavailability hypothesis or something like that. And after they get it to 2 or 3, they're kind of done, and they can't think of any more, and they go, oh, I guess I don't have so many reasons. I think that works well as just sit there and say, hey, you got all the time in the world. Tell me, what you're believing and why. And you might find that you get a better conversation when you let them exhaust themselves first to tell you everything they got on their mind.
Right. Good suggestion.
I don't know. It takes a while, though.
It
may take longer than you want to spend.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that they do is like when they say things with they start tearing up. They start like saying like absolutely absurd arguments and allegations of racism that, can't be backed up, like this. I'm constantly I'm subject to racism every day. And okay, and they don't back it up in anything but emotion, but because they're using this emotion, you're compelled to agree with them.
I don't know. It takes time, and my gut feeling on this is that you need a relationship before you can argue, and maybe you never argue. Dale Carnegie has a chapter of his book, and it's called "Don't Argue," and he said it's worse than rattlesnakes or earthquakes. Don't argue, and so it might be that you never get to that point where you do in a courtroom, where you do stand up and you have oral argument where you bring it. You say, here's why my client should win. That kind of stuff doesn't do well outside of a structured environment or an institution. It just doesn't do well. It gets people all flustered. I know what you're saying, Mike. I had a person I was talking to announced to me that she read Robin DiAngelo's book. And she said, all white people are racist. And I said, it doesn't strike me as right. And here's one reason. I know a guy he's what many people would consider white. I don't even like the idea of we categorize people in two colors. I think it's ridiculous. But, so I use white and black in scare quotes. And so I said, I know a guy who founded a nonprofit, like 15 years ago. He's dedicated to helping poor and minority people to get out of legal jams. He's been spending dedicating his life as a lawyer to doing that. And for you to tell me that he's a racist because he's white, that doesn't make any sense to me. And the conversation just kind of gummed up and stopped. And it's like it's hard to know where to go at that point. Maybe that's all you can do sometimes. Maybe what you do is you plant seeds and you say, hey, that doesn't make sense to me because of this. And you let them save face. Don't say, and therefore what you said is stupid, because that's not going to allow the next time you see them to be anything worthwhile. It's going to make them, dislike you. I'm assuming that our goal all the time is to encourage productive conversation. And it may not be that you can get much done in any one conversation. It may be that it's just bits and pieces, and we all have to grind together. It's a long game. We need patience, and a lot of us talk to a lot of us. It's just I don't know where to go with this, because I don't have any quick fix. I don't have a magic button where I say, here's how you convince somebody who believes in Ibram Kendi that that stuff is wrong. There's no way to do that. I don't know any way to do that. Although we can say, hey, tell me what you think, and here's where I disagree or whatever. And I'm convinced in my heart of heart that having a relationship, though, is the most important first step in any conversation. Showing respect for the other person, even when you disagree with them immensely. Everything out of their mouth you're disagreeing with. I think it's good just to say, hey, thanks for sharing. I don't know that I'm buying any of that, but thanks for sharing. And maybe that's all you can get done in an early conversation.
One of the other things that you talked about in your talk that really struck me, again, partly because of psychology, is this idea that the less information you have, the more coherent the story. And although certainly I've done a lot of research on narrative and also on this idea of coherence, that's we all want to be sort of consistent, and in telling our stories, we want this coherence across maybe even our lives. We want to be able to tell a story that has a particular story arc, so that it's very tellable. And I had never thought about this idea that I think maybe you also borrowed from Kahneman. I'm not sure. This idea that less evidence leads to a more coherent story, and that's sort of what we're talking about here. It's sort of what Mike mentioned. And when we have this coherent story, we're just going to maybe stick with it. We already tend not to unlearn, right? And forgetting maybe forgetting is our friend, but we don't forget easily. We tend to lose that sort of that correction tag that's maybe an addendum to an original memory, and so there's this sort of resistance to learn new, to adjust our story, and and it just divides us further, right? And I don't know. I don't know.
Kahneman's
it's scary.
He's got an acronym. It's a long one, and what it is it ends up being what you see is all there is, and it's you just take the first letter of each word, and that's his phrase, and what it refers to is the idea that the thing you're thinking about a lot right now fills your consciousness. That's the thing. For a lot of people, and you can imagine, especially for little kids, you see this all the time. You put a piece of candy in front of them, they can't see anything else. In fact, it's amazing. If you tell a kid, by the way, when you grow up, you'll actually think of things other than candy, and they go, no, there's no way that's possible. But as adults, we still have our favorite things that we fill our consciousness with, and yeah, whatever. Everybody's got their thing. Race cars, and a lot of them, to each his own. But I'm looking at my notes here. If I'm going to turn sideways because I want to get this right. So for Kahneman, the amazing things about this, what you see is all there is, our beliefs, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, are radically insensitive to both the quality and the quantity of the evidence. And as you mentioned, all we need is a good story. So a good story doesn't have to be well documented, and it can have poor quality, and it can still be a good, compelling story for a lot of people. Number two, it's easier to construct a coherent story when you have less evidence. And they had a study where participants who saw one-sided evidence were more confident of their judgments than those who saw both sides.
Right.
So this is what we're up against, and I'm not saying I'm always right in every argument. I mean, it sounds like I'm a know-it-all, and I'm always right in my arguments, and everyone else is messing up. Well, I mean, by the way, if you took a time machine and transported me back 15 years ago, and I met myself, I'd probably not like myself. I think I've changed a lot. I have very different views on some things, and so I'm just saying, for all of us, this pertains to all of us, that we have to be aware that we do make these stories. We make them quickly, we make them on less than optimal evidence, and they seem compelling, and we act on it. And maybe that's just the plight of being a human being, that you have, X number of hours on the planet, and, strutting your, self across the stage, and that's it. And you have to make decisions based upon less than, perfect evidence, and we act on the things, often as a
brief candle, life is but a tale told by a madman, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The end of Macbeth. I caught you there. I think that's the exact quote. I hope I haven't missed a word there. No, not at all.
There you go. I mangled it, but thank you for saving
me.
Me.
On there, and both of you are kind of really well articulated. And that's this idea that the quality of evidence and the quantity of evidence aren't really the most important things. And I think you're right, and I think I can kind of prove this with regards to critical social justice. So if you look at, there are some really interesting scholars out there in critical social justice who make some interesting points, but they're not very powerful. Or when they are powerful, like in the case of Crenshaw and her podcast, it's much more of a kind of a dumbed-down version of her work that's powerful, rather than the more nuanced and interesting stuff she did in the late 80s and early 90s, for example, with Mapping the Margins being the seminal paper. But if you look at who's really influencing people, and we can measure this purely in terms of book sales or in terms of how much money they're getting for speaking, how often they're being asked to speak, the prestigiousness of the speeches, the attendance, those kinds of things. We can quite easily empirically measure this. Then it's the least nuanced scholars, the kind of people that the more nuanced critical social justice scholars behind closed doors will say, oh yeah, these people are full of shit. And that's the Ibram X. Kendis and the Robin DiAngelos. Those are the most influential people in that movement. They're not the best arguments, but they're the most influential people because their stories somehow, I hesitate to use the word good, but their stories somehow resonate in a way that just these more complicated, thoughtful authors who say things that are interesting and require reflection upon, they just don't have that appeal.
There's
go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was going to go off just a little bit off topic, but it's relevant to this. So there's some research on narratives of illness, and one of the narratives is that the doctor is the hero. Okay, and people love this story because, of course, if you get ill, then the doctor will be the hero of your story. Also, they will give you medicine, and you will be cured. Right? This is the simple story, and it's the story that most people want to hear. And then, there's a few other stories to talk about, but I'm going to skip over those and go then to the story where nothing is working. You're chronically ill, and you've tried different treatments, and nothing is working. You're sick. This disease is only going to continue to make you sicker. And when you try to talk about all of the ways in which this illness is affecting your life, people shut down. This is called the chaos story because you've tried all these different things, none of them is working, and you're in this sort of, tornado almost of it's just chaos. And nobody wants to hear that story. And I think that a lot of what we have in the world right now is a chaos story, right? And the story that some people are offering is sort of a corollary of the medical story, right? Here's a pill, take the pill, and you feel better. It was bad, but this is going to make it better. And so I see these elements of not wanting to, people rejecting the sort of chaos that's real in favor of a story that makes someone else the hero or the villain, right? That's easy. It's easy to tell, and it's just the more coherent, complete story.
So, in terms of the racial reckoning, for instance, I can imagine those two stories applying that the first of all, you got the chaos story. You've got a group of folks in a dysfunctional part of town, a lot of violence, poverty, and a lot of things have been tried for a long period of time, and it's just not budging. The problem seems to be there. People are getting shot, and there's confrontations with police, and so on and so forth. And that's the chaos story. It's like, okay, so what are we supposed to do? So you could see, you would much rather have the doctor story, that there's a pill we can give. Here's the problem. It's, that all these folks are racist, and that's causing all these people to be, in their situation. There's an easy fix here. So you can see, and I'm guessing there's like probably dozens of versions of this we can come up with where you can spin it as a chaos theory where it's a difficult problem where we just can't figure it out. And like, which story would you rather have? I mean, if you have people just voting on it, who wants to vote for the smart doctor story? Well, everybody does. It's like, man, I want a solution. But in the first version of, or the version that I described, the sad version of reality in my city and many other cities, is that it's complicated. It's really complex. That seems to be the reality for me. And so when people march and protest and say that police are indiscriminately shooting black men who are unarmed, and then someone like Steven Pinker comes along and says, well, wait a minute, I have the statistics on this, and it's not thousands per year. It's actually about 18 per year. And that's throwing us back into the chaos theory. So you can see why, and that's what they did. They tried to cancel, I forget the Psychological Association tried to cancel Steven Pinker. So you could see why they don't want to hear about that. And there was a recent article on Heterodox blog where I think it was two teachers have a method that they promote where they say, no, what you really need to do is you have to have, they had 4 steps, but I remember the first and the fourth. It was basically, the first part is you have to say, what's really going on? And then, only then can you say, okay, what do we think about it and what should we do about it? And their point is that I think a lot of people are skipping ahead to the end, at the beginning. They're saying, okay, here's something we want to do about it, but we don't even yet want to take the time to figure out the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, I mean...
And this idea that people, like you said, people just don't want to hear it, and they don't want to hear the chaos story. And, we talked earlier about, you don't unlearn the doctor story. When you get sick, you don't unlearn the doctor story, even when, you're in chaos. You still have this hope that there'll be a cure, right? That there'll be an answer, and that the medical profession will become the hero. So
I wonder
say,
how often people want their doctor to be more sure and more confident than that doctor actually is. Like that's part of why I'm paying that doctor.
Yes.
Say, don't worry, we're gonna beat this thing. We're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
Theoretically,
good.
this
You
kind
walk
of
away
antidote
feeling really good
to chaos that they tend to present is this insistence upon lived experience, right? There is, it's all about my personal narrative. Things like the application of empiricism, which would reveal the kind of complex, somewhat chaotic reality that we can't really fully detect, we can't really fully engage with, that you're kind of alluding to. They would argue that is, in and of itself, an excuse to further or preserve your own white, cis, heteronormative power. I mean, if you read this book, for example, this is... if you like, the Bible of critical race theory, and it was compiled by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she basically says that in the introduction, that there is no such thing really as objectivity, not insofar as political theory or anything in the social sciences or humanities, and that if you're trying to pretend at that, then that is in and of itself an act of power, an act of oppressive power, or an act of resistive power. And she's saying we're doing it in resistance, and so this kind of this antidote to chaos, this in my view refusal to deal with reality, seems to be fairly central to everything that they're thinking, and the consequences couldn't be worse.
So
it's easier. It's easier to destruct,
I sort of
take something apart and destroy it rather than to build it up. And it's almost like a variation of Brandolini's law, where you can take words and say this word doesn't mean anything, and this institution doesn't mean anything, and just go, torch the whole place and torch the language, torch everything, and you'll succeed, because I think it's child's play to destroy things. It's really hard to build them up. So that's just my initial reaction to what you said, Mike.
Well, that's sort of where I was
a Tolkien quote, very quickly. Evil cannot create anything new. They can only corrupt and ruin what good forces have invented or made. Very good. Anyway, sorry, Elizabeth.
Well, no, this is sort of where I was going. So if we talk about this from a very practical standpoint, so, for somebody like me who's been canceled, and I, go to maybe department meetings or whatever, and I'm just thinking to myself, how can I put some of this into practice, right? How can I engage with people? How can I listen, and not just hear that I'm I don't know. How can I listen with curiosity, I guess, instead of listening in pain?
Yeah.
How can I hear when they don't hear me, I guess? I don't know how to move forward.
I can't pretend to know how to advise someone in your situation. I have never been in that situation, and it must be tough, because I know you have some people who are difficult to look at in the room because they weren't there for you when you needed them, and things like that.
But you do have some good
I guess-
stories about people who have come together. Very
That's right.
unlikely people.
Please, yeah.
Should I go over a few of those?
Sure.
Okay, let me see if I can pull them up because I'm. Well, let's see. Where are they? Heroes? No, that's not it. I'm going to pull it up. It's not just going to take a second.
Sure.
I just got to pull up the name of one of them. Elizabeth, who did I mention? There's a whole bunch of them. Daryl. I'll look up Daryl first, and that will pull the whole thing up.
Yeah, I mean, I remember
This is
when
a
I was
boring-
listening to you talk about this, I just thought, I can't imagine, how this person had the courage to, to ask, do you want to go on a speaking engagement with me, or do you,
Right. Yeah.
who
Exactly. And I have my list.
Daryl Davis.
I think I mentioned Daryl Davis earlier, I believe, and he's, or maybe that was in a prior meeting I just had today. I'm sorry if I'm confusing the two, but he's one of my favorite. So here's this man who identifies as a black man who's a musician, who's sitting there at a table during a break in the music, and he's got some guys sitting there, some white guys who eventually tell him that with the KKK. No one in the world would have blamed him for getting up and saying, "Hey, I got to go." No one would have blamed him. But he's truly an amazing guy, and he said, "Tell me more." He stuck it out, and he stayed there, and he said, "Tell me more." And he listened, and I don't know how many times he actually saw these guys where at some point they said, "You know what? We've been making a big mistake. We have a bag of our robes, our KKK robes. We are never going to wear these again. It was a big mistake. It was a take them. I never want to see them again." So they turned him in, and then they introduced him to their friends who are also KKK members. And if you really want to hear the story, Daryl's on a number of sources telling the story, and you really, if you want to feel good about an amazing man and what he accomplished, listen to him tell these stories. But it ended up being something like 22 members of the KKK gave him their robes, and then something like 200 members told him they're out of it. They're not doing it anymore. And it was because of him. He was just a class guy, and they recognized him for his humanity. They didn't know anything about him based upon the way he looked. And that's his key line. It's like, what do you know about me just based upon the way I look? And he sold that to them. And there was a picture I put in my presentation where he's standing next to one of these guys who had given it up, and it's great. But there's more, and my list included Nixon going to China. Okay, you got Shirley Chisholm, the first elected black member of Congress, who, when George Wallace was shot and he's in his hospital room, she visited him. And she said, "Hey, what happened to you shouldn't happen to anybody." And he apparently, according to this account, started sobbing. And then they started talking politics a bit, and she's saying, "Hey, I think actually we agree on some things."
Yeah.
That's amazing. I already told you about Daryl Davis. Megan Phelps Roper from the Westboro Baptist Church became friends with David Arbitol, a Jewish blogger, who challenged her in a friendly, considerate, nice way on Twitter to think about some things. He said, "What about this? About your views?" And she said it pulled her out of there. She now gives lectures all over the country about her experience being caught up in the cult. But these are examples over and over of people you would think, what are they doing sticking it out? You have even others. You have I think I even mentioned the Christmas truce during World War I, when the soldiers got out of the trenches and started singing Christmas carols, playing soccer, and exchanging gifts. For at least it was for 24 hours, and I know they got back in and started shooting each other later. But it's something when you think like, oh man, I can't talk to that person because they're ridiculous. Are you sure you want to give up on them? Because people do change. People do change. I know people who've changed dramatically over, it may not happen in 2 weeks or a month, but it may happen in a year. It may happen in a couple of years where they come back and they go, something you said got me thinking. And I know that it's happened a couple times where I'm sure it's not just what I said, it was the way I said it. And it's like, hey, I know this is how I see it. And I wasn't trying to argue. I wasn't trying to belittle them, make them look like they lost an argument. And I think that's really important.
Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe someday.
Yeah, those two are like really, really, really big rivals. Tyson. You go onto YouTube, type in hot boxing with Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, and you can see the two of them sat at the table and laughing and joking together. And obviously, clearly they've become friends. So if you can think of two, you couldn't have more bitter rivals than those two, right? Go on.
I think. Well, I'll give you one more example because I think Elizabeth was alluding to this one. It was Larry Flint. Who published Hustler magazine, put a parody in his magazine where Jerry Falwell's character, his drawn character, was learning to have sex in a outhouse with his own mother, and so Falwell was outraged and sued Flint. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, where Flint won because it was a parody, and so nothing then happened for 8 years. Until Falwell calls Flint, and I should emphasize, it was about as bitter as it can get. Two people hating each other about as much as, at least Falwell hating Flint. And Falwell calls Flint and says, hey, how about you and I go on the Larry King show and talk, have a conversation? And Flint agreed, and they did. And then they had other conversations, and they ended up going on tour around the country, the two of them, talking about First Amendment and about moral issues as friends. So, when you say, I'll never talk to that person again, they're ridiculous. I think you ought to plant seeds. I mean, just, you shouldn't inflame the hate. Hate begets hate. Isn't that one of King's statements? It does. So it just doesn't work. But planting seeds does, and just saying, "Hey, thanks for talking. I'm sorry we don't see eye to eye on these things, but thanks for talking." That's in my mind. That's the obvious thing.
It will have blood.
Whenever you think
blood will have blood. So another Macbeth quote.
There you go.
We've been talking on these about how to build a network. So how to, one of the things I did was go to Counterweight when I was alone. I went to Counterweight, and I felt very, very lucky that they responded, and they actually referred me to FIRE, who also helped. And so we've been talking to each of our guests about how to build a network, how to be prepared, because you won't know. I say prepared, you can't, because you won't know, as you mentioned before, who your friends will be and who won't be, and you will be surprised. It is always very, everybody we talk to has said the same thing. It's surprising to them, like who has remained their friend and who hasn't. And it isn't always family, and it isn't always people that you were closest to. But we have been sort of asking people what kinds of networks they would recommend, just to learn a little bit, to reach out, maybe join a different, like you can join the FIRE. You can get the notifications. You can just for free. You can just sign up, get the notifications, become a little more educated, maybe, about some of the things that are going on. I don't know if you have any recommendations about how people might build a network. You had some actually on your Dangerous Intersections blog. You had some organizations linked. I didn't know if you were interested in sharing any of those, or how you became sort of got to know those organizations.
Well, I don't recall which ones I have on my website. I'd have to go check that out. But I can tell you, social media.
I'll just tell you, one of them is, hang on a second, the Oregon Association of Scholars, because you linked There's actually like you can download it's almost like a poster responding to social justice rhetoric, which was really good. But it also linked to the Oregon Association of Scholars, which is affiliated with the National Association of Scholars. And I also found, when I went to your site, the Civics Alliance, which has some templates, and it's also linked to the National Association of Scholars. And just, the Civics Alliance sort of grew out of that, I guess. I just spent a little time, poking around in that. And that had some really great tools, too.
I would start with this overarching thought of the Solomon Asch social science studies from the 50s. You're probably both familiar with these, where someone who was in a room with like three stooges were in a room, and then there's one legitimate subject who, after everybody else gave the wrong answer on how long the line was, they watched to see whether the person would conform or not with the wrong answer. And there's a lot of pressure on people to conform, to say the wrong thing, even when it's so simple, even when it's a basic perceptual task, much less a complex social task. And so the thought that, and when they put one other person in that told the truth, so like two wrong answers, one right answer, and then you almost always say the right answer. You ignore the wrong answers. There's no more stickiness there, to use your term. But there's nothing like knowing you're not alone. It really is. I gave an example. I grew up. I never was a believer in any sort of religion. And that was, I was born in the 50s, and there was no internet, there were no books. I was totally, totally alone. And then when I was like 16 or 17, and my dad was like trying to shove it down my throat too. So somewhere around 16 or 17, I came across a book by Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and it was explosions. And I remember the next time my dad confronted me, I had like 80 things to say, and he didn't know which way to, he was so angry that, it's like, but I had a friend, and here it was a friend who was probably dead at that point. It's pretty amazing, the written word,
he died in the
70s. But these organizations, they're...
Yeah, I think.
Oh, maybe, yeah. So maybe it was right around that time. I know you lived very long. You lived to be almost 100. But there's nothing like having an organization where you can talk to folks. Now, the thing about social media, that would be the obvious place to go. It's actually rather funny, and I know that's predictable, and you guys are going to have experienced this. But if I post an article that is heterodox, I'll just say heterodox. It's like, it's not the kind of thing that most of my liberal friends will see, because they stick with, Washington Post and New York Times and that kind of thing. In fact, they'll think I'm crazy for thinking I'm going to cite anything that's not from their standard legacy news sources. And I'll hear grumbling and, whining, and then I'll get private notes about, thanks, that was really interesting. But you won't get public stuff. You won't get public likes. And I'll see this all the time, where people will see me on the street and they go, thanks for publishing that stuff. I can't even like it because someone's going to see it, and I don't want to deal with that. So, you gather people, maybe one by one. Maybe just you talk to your friends and you have courageous conversations at first, and then you're going to find there's a lot of people who think like you. They're out there. They exist, and they are trouble too, but they just are frozen. They're afraid to say anything, but they'll talk to you if you go first. So sometimes it's a matter of who's going to be brave, who's going to step up and say something like, hey, what do you think of this? And they go, I don't know. And then you say what you think, and they go, I kind of agree with you, but I'm a little nervous about talking about that in my workplace or my school or wherever.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think getting people one-on-one, you're going to have better luck. So much interaction at universities, we're very autonomous, right? And so much of our interaction with our peers is in large groups in a department meeting once a month or whatever. And we don't really, maybe at the copy machine or something like that. But we tend not to, part we got into this profession because we like being alone, right? Who else would write a dissertation, So I think that, and so I think maybe that's something that I think I could take away from this is, finding maybe an opportunity to talk to just one person alone. And I don't know who that would be, and I don't know, what that opportunity might when or how that opportunity might present itself. But to maybe I would feel more courageous with just one person as opposed to feeling nervous or overwhelmed by the large group. And
we of course all met.
Yes,
we met at Heterodox Academy, which is a great place to meet like-minded people who are not so like-minded necessarily. I had a line in my talk. I said, okay, I'll talk for 50 minutes and then we're going to have discussion. Now, don't get in a fist fight during the discussion. It'd be bad for the brand. But it's obvious, we're there because we're trying to think differently than each other. It was a little hard to find people who thought differently because I think everybody I met was really, they had varying views about a lot of things, but we all do. And it was a normal thing. It was like there's no pushback. And like in a lot of places today, you say something and someone says, oh, you shouldn't say that. That's not proper to say that word. Or like one time I said, because I live in a neighborhood that's not, we have some crime. And I said, I don't want to get, robbed by a thug on the street. And they said, no, you can't say the word thug. I'm thinking, it means someone who commits crimes as far as I know. But you hear a lot of this scolding in a lot of places, the closing of the Overton window. And it was neat to be at HXA, Heterodox Academy, to have a bunch of people who weren't scolding us. We were just talking about, and if we disagreed, good. Hey, tell me more. I like to hear that. Let's find out why we disagree.
That's
That's a good thing.
Those are the conversations in which you're kind of really the most alive, or you're playing with ideas. It's going back and forward. You're learning new things. You're either having your idea tested or you're acquiring a new one. That's what every intellectual should live for. I think one of the problems is that we've opened up academia to people who aren't really intellectually curious, who think they have all the answers, and then anyone who disagrees with them is evil. Good.
I was trying to think of a metaphor for it. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was just going to say, heterodox felt normal. Having been an academic, for 25 years or whatever, that felt normal again. So this time right now doesn't feel normal. Like Mike said, it feels like I can't imagine that the people who are saying and doing some of the things that they are would personally, privately, tell a story that this is why they became an academic. That they probably also had some of the same ideals and everything, the same curiosity and everything that we did. And they're not displaying it now, and I'm not really sure why. But being at Heterodox, and I guess that's why we've been trying to mention it, is that there are places to feel normal again, right? That if you've been canceled, there are places.
Places where you give each other charitable readings, places where you give each other space. If you want spontaneity and humor and normal things that we used to love, you got to put up with occasional missteps and gaffes, and where someone says something, they go, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that," and everyone just laughs. They go, "Yeah, this human being is trying to communicate and be funny and whatever." And that's the only way to be spontaneous and funny, is to occasionally misstep. It was delightful to be in that environment, and there are friends I have that are absolutely that way still. But there's the scolds. I don't know what to call them other than the scolding people who are out there telling you, you should have had a trigger warning or whatever. And I'm thinking, really, you go home with your friends when you're in the privacy of your own apartment, you give each other trigger warnings? I don't think so. Do you scold each other about you're using the wrong pronoun when it's your friends? Really?
By the
Especially
way,
when the pronoun changes 3 times last week?
And trigger warning, by the way, that, I think that has a bad connotation now, too, with the whole gun thing. So, I don't even think they can call it a trigger warning. So they'd have to call it something else. I don't know. Yeah, Pat Benatar is no longer. Pat Benatar is no longer singing "Hit Me with Your Best Shot" in her concert.
Oh, for God's sake.
Because she felt that it was invoked violence. So we'll have to come up with a new name for trigger warnings.
I think we do have a lot of violence, and we have way too much in our movies and TV. But it seems like people are smart enough to know the difference between a word that means literally what it means and a word that's used in a metaphorical or an extended way. But anyway, that'd be a whole different topic. But the people are out there. I would just suspect that if the people, just random people that I would bump into in life, that 60-70% of them have no interest in the way the world has gotten, the way conversation has gotten. They have no interest in this.
Yeah.
They hate it, but they're afraid to speak up.
Research shows exactly the same thing, and it also shows that the vast majority of ethnic minorities, gay people and so on, too, don't have any time for this stuff that claims to be intervening on their behalf. They don't recognise that, and they don't like it. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we're nearly at the hour mark right now. I guess we can close it off there. So just to summarize, we looked at Brandolini's law, which, for a very quick summary, means that it's very easy to make some bullshit, nonsensical, incoherent argument and for it to stick. And then once it has stuck, once it's kind of taken root in a person, once they've kind of invested their identities into it, it's very hard to then dislodge it. I think, as the famous author Carl Sagan once wrote in The Demon Haunted World, I think, once you give a charlatan power over your identity, you almost never get it back. However, I like that one. However, we also quoted a lot of Macbeth, or I did, and then we also looked about the fact that the good news is that people change, and we gave some examples. We looked at we talked about Daryl Davis, the famous black jazz musician, who decided to have conversations with these KKK members who hated him by virtue of him being black. And nevertheless, by him humanizing them and emphasizing that shared humanity and not dehumanizing them, he was able to gently erode at those beliefs, and now he has a wardrobe full of the Ku Klux Klan costumes that he's been given by these people who now repudiate completely what they had passionately believed before. So maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe Carl Sagan was a bit pessimistic in that regard. And finally, and I think that this has been an important thing that we've emphasized in every conversation we've had so far, and I hope we continue to in the future, because I think this is the way that things do change. It's important to realize that you're not alone. It's important to realize that even when you are afraid to speak, and you can see that other people are afraid to speak, and that the people with whom you disagree most, the bullies, the ideological bullies, can speak freely and people will go along with it, that it doesn't follow that they're in the majority. And actually experience tells us, both anecdotally and empirically, that these people are an extreme minority. Good. All right. Thank you very much. Good. All right. Thank you very much.
It was great to meet both of you at Heterodox Academy. Maybe I'll see you next year.
Yeah,
whatever that is. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
The pleasure was all ours.